Hello, I'm William Sanchez, and this is the Philosophical Rebellion Substack. Today, I want to talk about my transition to becoming a socialist, because it's actually a term I really wanted to stay away from throughout my life, because it's so controversial, and it immediately turns people off of your perspective once you say that you believe in socialism. It elicits some people's worst stereotypes, and once you start off with that framing, it's really hard to break it. But I grew up disillusioned with the American economy, witnessing the elites taking in far more than they deserved, while normal working people were taking in far less than they earned. And then I started investing in high school, and that was a real culture shock, witnessing how the investor class thinks about the economy versus how normal working people think about the economy. So when somebody like Warren Buffett was worried about investing in companies with pricing power to then corner a market and then extract extra profit, that is a good investing strategy. But what that means for the American consumer is that a handful of mega corporations are attempting to monopolize a market so that they are not forced to lower their prices due to competition, enabling those corporations to price gouge the American consumer. So when the investor class and the working class all work in their own interest, they actually have competing interests that cannot both be met. And at the same time, I was trying to make my own money in the stock market. So I was very morally conflicted attempting to invest in companies that I knew were harmful to the overall American consumer. And one of those companies that I invested in was Amazon. And that was at a time when Jeff Bezos was the richest person in the world. And in my view, that did not make any sense because many Amazon workers, even after working full time, still relied on welfare to cover their basic costs of living. And Amazon was being heavily subsidized by the federal and state governments and was a major consumer of our infrastructure. But the corporation itself paid an extremely low tax rate and sometimes even got rebates from the government when they made a profit. So something was obviously broken in the economy. And it's not like Jeff Bezos stood out as the abnormality there. The same is true with Walmart and the Waltons, who are the richest family in America, and they made their wealth off of shareholders' stock. The Government Accountability Office actually found that 70% of welfare recipients worked full-time, mostly at low-wage corporations, and they found the top 5 employers of welfare recipients were Amazon, Walmart, McDonald's, Dollar General, and Kroger. So we have this situation in the American economy where workers at mainstream corporations are getting paid welfare wages and creating great wealth through their labor. But the great wealth that they create is being sent to corporate executives and shareholders. And I think that's totally backwards. The American economy is suffering from a parasitic infection that's siphoning the wealth of the working class and taking it all for themselves. But that is not welfare queens, and that is not immigrants. That is the 1%. And it does not have to be this way. And that's why I feel personally obligated not just to defend a new version of capitalism, but to defend socialism. And that came from my realization of what socialism actually was, which I realized when I read Harry Truman's definition of socialism. So what Harry Truman said in 1952 is that socialism is a scare word. He said a lot more stuff too, but that's the gist of it. And that's all socialism is today. It is a scare word used by the elites to describe the economic interests of the working class. And at the same time that socialism was being vilified by the economic elites, a heavily corrupted version of capitalism called trickle-down was being pushed by the elites. So after realizing that we live in an era of propaganda where the terms socialism and capitalism have been heavily corrupted, I wanted to go back to the beginning, to the father of capitalism, Adam Smith, to figure out what he even said. And Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same time of America's Declaration of Independence. Adam Smith lived in a time of monarchies which worked in their own self-interest to rule their territory and subjects. Those governments frequently abused their power to extract wealth from the labor of others through taxation and the creation of monopolies. Then they brutally enforced unfair economic laws. And Adam Smith realized that in a control economy, overproduction of unnecessary goods is common, competition is limited, innovation is rare, and problem businesses are artificially kept alive. So, one of Adam Smith's main realizations was that an overly controlling government is harmful to the economy. So, government should stay out of the market to enable the free exchange of goods at the level of individuals, communities, businesses, and investors, instead of having a government control the means of production. But there is also another side to Adam Smith which is commonly ignored by the capitalists of today. Adam Smith argued that the citizens of every state should contribute to the public expense. He said the rich should contribute at the highest rate of the whole society. He also endorsed regulations on economic activity, saying that all governments should restrict or regulate activity which could harm wider society. And about the minimum wage, Adam Smith said, "A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must, even upon most occasions, be somewhat more." There were actually so many shocking quotes from Adam Smith that in my book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know, I included a full page of them. So these next few quotes come directly from the father of capitalism. "All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. We rarely hear, it has been said, of the combinations of masters, though frequently of those of workmen. But whoever imagines upon this account that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. The interest of businessmen is always in some respects different from, and even opposite to, that of the public. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. The disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, though necessary to both establish and to maintain the distinction of ranks and the order of society, is at the same time the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently more principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." So even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, warned of the greed of the economic elites. So inside of America, we have the exact economy that the father of capitalism warned about. The elites inside of the American economy are still living by the vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. Those elites have combined to corrupt the American economy. So now we have laws and regulations of commerce coming directly from the economic elites, which pervert the US economy to serve their interests against the interests of the public. So now, instead of having a flourishing and happy American economy, we have one with the majority of the members poor and miserable, with the elites enjoying more economic freedom and wealth than at any other point in human history. And culturally, we admire and almost worship wealth rather than valuing labor. And unlike all the governments that Adam Smith was discussing, the American government was not a monarchy. So despite being aware of the many ways in which government overreach could harm the economy, America's founders in the Constitution granted Congress the power to regulate commerce. And that's because the American government was not a monarchy ruling our territory through force, but it was created through the consent of the governed to represent the interests of the citizens. So America's founders wrote the purpose of government in the preamble of the Constitution. So the purpose of government is to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So government was granted the power to regulate commerce with the intent to form a more perfect union, promote the general welfare, and secure liberty to all Americans. And within America's constitutional framework, the government actually developed a new relationship with the economy. And that's probably best summarized by this quote from Elon Musk. Musk said, "It's government's responsibility to establish the rules of the game and ensure that those rules are properly enforced. I think that's an important role for government." But the struggle is about determining what the right rules of the American economy should be and getting those rules properly enforced. And in that pursuit, the American labor movement worked decades to create employee protections and improve compensation for the working class. And that battle started with Abraham Lincoln, who said, "In all ages of the world, some have labored and others have, without labor, enjoyed a large proportion of the fruits. That is wrong and should not continue. To each laborer, the whole product of his labor, or as nearly as possible, is a most worthy object of any good government." And modern-day socialism descends directly from that sentiment Abraham Lincoln represented. So Abraham Lincoln aligned himself with the working class of America, and with that gave rise to the labor movement. And the values of that labor movement were best explained in Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech, in which he advocated for an end to the political activity of corporations, breaking up monopolies, that anyone who worked full-time should be able to provide for themselves and their family, that no person was more entitled to special privileges than another, the right to regulate the terms and conditions of labor, the right to regulate the use of wealth in the public interest, and not just for fair play under the current rules of the game, but changing the rules of the game to establish a more substantial equality of opportunity. And Theodore Roosevelt, just like Abraham Lincoln and just like Adam Smith before him, all discussed the eternal battle between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess. Or, as Adam Smith put it, the masters and the workmen. So the labor movement in America worked decades from the time of Abraham Lincoln through the time of Theodore Roosevelt up until FDR, when the New Deal reforms actually created a better economy for the majority of workers through policy changes like a maximum work week, a minimum wage, and employee protections in the workplace. And all of those New Deal reforms created the middle class, which transferred wealth from the elites to the working class, enabling the working class to amass moderate fortunes. And Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism economic ideology, combined with FDR's New Deal reforms, actually created a massive benefit to the working class at the expense of the elites. And that's where the definition of socialism came from. Socialism became a scare word, not just for FDR's New Deal reforms, but for the entire economic ideology of the American labor movement. Socialism became a scare word used to describe the economic interest of the working class. Under trickle-down economics, socialism became synonymous with the idea that it is government's responsibility to establish the rules of the game and ensure that those rules are properly enforced. And under trickle-down economics, the 1% have reasserted their dominance in the American economy. So today, in America, 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. The top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. And over the last 30 years, the top 1% has seen a $21 trillion increase in their wealth. At the same time, the bottom half of American society has seen a $900 billion decline in their wealth. Going back to the 1970s, there has actually been a $50 trillion upwards redistribution of wealth away from the working class to the 1%. And that has happened in the form of stagnating wages for workers in the bottom 95% of the American economy, while corporate executives and shareholders have been taking in an increasingly large share of the American economy. So, in modern America, the eternal battle between those who possess more than they have earned versus those who have earned more than they possess looks like the battle between the working class versus the shareholder class. And I think Americans need to ask themselves, does the Walton family deserve to be worth over $240 billion, mostly from Walmart stock, while their workers made less than a living wage? Did Jeff Bezos deserve to be the wealthiest man in the world for a few years when Amazon workers were relying on welfare? Does Elon Musk deserve to make 40,000 times the average Tesla employee's compensation? Should Warren Buffett pay a lower tax rate than his secretary? To me, the obvious answer to those questions is no. But aside from Bernie Sanders, there are very few members of Congress that agree with my perspective. And that is why we need Bernie Sanders' Saving American Democracy constitutional amendment. Because right now, and for the last several decades, the elites, the big businesses, the billionaires, the 1% have had way too much power over the American government, and they have corrupted our economic policy in their favor. So not only do we need to completely reevaluate our economic laws, we also need to end the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, which is a recommendation that comes directly from the radical socialist Theodore Roosevelt. So when a lot of the mainstream media discusses socialism restricting economic freedom, who are they talking about it restricting freedom for? Because if it restricts the freedom of big businesses to price gouge the American consumer, or monopolize a market, or pollute the environment, I am all for restricting those freedoms. The elites have had way too much freedom to corrupt the American economy. But socialism is actually a pro-freedom economic ideology. It just represents the freedom of the working class. And socialism would mean radically expanding the economic freedom of all members of the working class at the expense of the economic freedom of the 1%. And that's why socialism is so vilified today by the economic elites, because socialism is the biggest threat to their dominance in the American economy and their power over the American government. And that's why socialism is a scare word used by the economic elites. By spreading mass propaganda to reframe the debate between capitalism, the only successful economic ideology in history, versus radical socialism that always ends in tyranny and authoritarianism, then socialism seems worse. But those are just dishonest talking points. They do not actually engage with the history of the American labor movement or the history of American policy, which is now called socialism. So now Bernie Sanders' socialism is actually far more aligned with Adam Smith's teachings and the values laid out in the preamble of the Constitution than the horribly corrupted trickle-down economic ideology has ever been. Trickle-down economics is a horribly corrupted version of capitalism, and ending the era of trickle-down economics in American policy and in American culture is one of the most important changes that needs to happen today. And that could start with the 99% realizing that socialism is nothing more than a scare word used to describe the economic interests of the working class. So don't let the economic elites fool you into supporting policy which represents their own freedom and not yours. Instead, it is time for the working class to finally unify, and once and for all, put an end to the vile maxim of the masters of mankind.